You're listening to the Bold Apologia podcast. Here you can expect to find real conversation and dialogue centralized around the purpose for sharing the hope of Jesus Christ in light of theology, apologetics, and culture. We hope and believe this episode will add confidence to your faith by equipping you with boldness to share the good news of the gospel. And now, your host, Adam Parker.
Listeners, hey, this is Adam, and yes, I am the host of the Bold Apologia podcast, and I'm excited to get into this topic that I will be sharing on. As many of you may know, I took some time to respond to someone by the name of Julie Roys on the David Wood controversy that has recently taken place. I've got to say, especially on YouTube, that particular podcast has really taken off, and I just want to say thank you to those of you who gave really kind feedback regarding it. If you've not listened to it yet, in it I deal with what I believe to be Julie Roy's uncharitable response to David Wood's public confession to having sexual intercourse with two minors prior to his conversion. At this time, he was an atheist who rejected societal norms. And so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that podcast, I highly encourage you to go back and do so, because it actually sets the stage for a lot of what I'm going to be discussing in today's podcast. Now, today, we are going to look at Dawa double standards and give a response to Islamic apologists who I believe have hypocritically responded to David Wood's confession. And we are actually going to take a look at what Dawa is, for those of you who don't know what it is. We're also going to take a look at how some Muslim critics in the Dawa apologetics space have actually used David Wood's pre-conversion sin against him. Yeah, which I will point out why I find that to be quite hypocritical. But we're also going to take a look at what mainstream Sunni sources actually say about, yes, the Prophet Muhammad's marriage to a 6-year-old by the name of Aisha. That's why I believe there's a lot of hypocrisy going on. Not only that, we're going to look at how the common defenses of that marriage line up with the sources, and finally, whether the moral standards being applied on each side are really all that consistent. And I do need to say this isn't an attack on Muslims as people. Though, if you are a Muslim listening, I'm going to say this boldly, and I mean it in love. You need to repent and believe the gospel just as God commands in the true holy scriptures found in the Bible. Okay? I've got to say that straight up. Here's the deal. I do believe that Muslims are made in the image of God, that Muslims are loved by God. And so this podcast is really about arguments and sources and standards. It's not meant to dehumanize anyone. With that said, let's dive in. What is Dawa? What do I mean when I say Dawa? Well, the Arabic word Dawa means invitation or summons, and in Islamic usage, it actually refers to the act of inviting people to Islam, explaining Islamic beliefs and practices, and calling both non-Muslims and Muslims to follow what is seen by these Dawa types as the true path. So Dawa often includes preaching about Allah, presenting Muhammad as the final prophet, calling people to accept Islam, and often defending Islam against objections. In the modern online world, a lot of Dawa takes place in apologetic form. You'll see it on YouTube debates and reaction videos. You'll see it in TikTok clips responding to Christian apologists, and you'll even see it as street corner evangelism streamed online, which often become honestly personal and aggressive. And that's the context where David Wood's name keeps coming up. As many of you know, David Wood's story is not a rumor. It's something that he has actually openly told online in a live stream. And according to his own testimony and reporting about his life, as a teenager, he was an atheist and he was extremely violent. And at the age of 18, he actually attacked his father with a hammer in an attempt to kill him. Praise God, his father survived, but later in prison, he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy while still in the criminal justice system. And recently, very recently, he admitted publicly that before his conversion, he had sexual relations with girls aged 13 and 15 while he was out on bail, which is conduct that is rightly described as sexual abuse of minors. Those are hard facts. They're not gossip. They come from David's own descriptions and from critical reporting about him. David is simply sharing this to say, I was deeply evil and Jesus transformed me. That's the point behind what he's trying to do here. Now, this obviously led to some rather opportunistic people, such as many of these Dawa types. I'm not going to go into detail on some of the things that they've said, but it's quite interesting how hypocritical many of them have been in discrediting Christianity and David Wood on the basis of what he did when he was an atheist, rather than based on how he's living as a Christian. Regardless, in the online space, especially among some of these Muslims, yes, particularly the Da'wa Islamic Apologetics world, his past is often used in this way, saying things like he's a psychopath, you can't trust anything he says, or a man who tried to kill his father and abused minors cannot be credible, putting him down based on these reasons rather than looking at his arguments. And this is all basically an attempt to say, if this is your convert, Christianity doesn't work. Which is quite crazy, because as Christians we would say, wow, if God can turn a life like David Wood's life around like that, Christianity must be true. But for some reason, these Dawa apologists, they don't really seem to see it that way. For Dawa apologists, his pre-conversion sins actually become a club to beat him with and a pretext to dismiss all of his arguments without engaging them. And because David Wood's ministry has struck a nerve in the Dawa world, many were quick to seize his story as an opportunity to respond with the most aggressive, uncharitable, and hostile rhetoric they could muster. But here's the kicker. The same critics will strongly resist moral scrutiny of Muhammad's actions as recorded in their own sources. And that is the double standard, the hypocrisy that I want to examine. To do that honestly, though, we do need to take a look straight at the Islamic texts. And I'm not going to go on a big reading spree, but I believe that any Dawa apologist or Muslim would agree that I'm sharing factual information, and I'm going to refer to the sources, and I'm really going to stick with the mainstream Sunni sources that are widely accepted. They are Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, other hadith collections such as Sunan an-Nasa'i and Sunan ibn Majah, summaries from traditionalist Muslim scholarship even, and all of these sources were taken into account to clarify the information that I am using in this podcast. First, let's take a look at Bukhari on Aisha's age. In Sahih al-Bukhari, in the book of marriage, there is a well-known report from Aisha herself. She says, the Prophet married her when she was 6 years old and consummated his marriage when she was 9 years old, and then she remained with him for 9 years until he died. That is the information I could gather. That wording is repeated in multiple hadith in Bukhari with the same core content. And Sahih Muslim contains several variants of the same tradition, often reporting Aisha saying that Muhammad married her when she was 6. She was taken to his house as a bride when she was 9. And this is gross and awful and evil, but consummated the marriage there. Not only that, but as part of the story, her dolls were with her at the time. She even said, I used to play with dolls in the presence of the Prophet. Yikes. That is awful. She was at the maturity level of a child. She was playing with dolls as a child. Gross. Gross. That is a lot to process. I don't even know if I want to think any further on that because of just how evil it is. That is abuse of a child. I really do believe that. Well, here's the thing. Let's take a look at what is said in the broader classical summary. If you step back and you look at classical Sunni tradition and serious modern summaries, they seem to convey the same information. Aisha is consistently presented as a child at the time of marriage and at the time of consummation. The common numbers used, obviously, for those of you listening, are age 6, though there are some who actually try to argue that she was 7, as if that is any better. Consummation took place at 9, and again, sometimes people try to say 10. This is in minority interpretations, but good grief, it's still childhood. It's no better. Traditionalist Muslim institutes which defend the Prophet on the issue openly acknowledge the 6 to 9 narrative as authentic and then attempt to actually justify it historically or contextually. Then there's modern revisionists who have some other attempts. A handful of modern Muslim writers try to argue that she was older by suggesting that there were numerical errors in the hadith. Why would they do this? Because the traditional and likely accurate narrative is simply gross. Nevertheless, these are real arguments worth noting. But even Muslim scholars who respond to Western criticism acknowledge plainly that Bukhari and Muslim contain hadith where Aisha states she married the Prophet at 6 and consummated the marriage at 9. So the dominant classical narrative presents Aisha as a child in both marriage and consummation. That is the factual baseline, and it's gross, and it is defended. Yet I hear these same Dawa Muslims who defend that, discrediting David Wood because he had intercourse with a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old when he was an 18-year-old atheist prior to converting to Christianity. Essentially, they are criticizing the behavior of an atheist rather than a Christian. Already, it seems ridiculous that these Dawa types would defend Muhammad if they are so vehemently against what David Wood did. Regardless, let's take a look at some of these defenses, and I will try to be as brief as possible. Defense number one, they would say it was normal for the time. Early marriages were more common historically. That's true. They did take place. I don't want to go into the details of it. I don't want to go into the morality of it. I don't want to go through all the ins and outs of it. But let's pay attention to that for just a moment. The reason why they would say this is because they're giving credence to the idea that it would be wrong today to do that, to marry a child. But Islam claims Muhammad is a normative example for all times. What does that mean? Meaning that he is the example for Muslims, not just the 7th century Arabia. The Quran states that he is an excellent example for believers. Therefore, appealing only to cultural norms clashes with that theological claim. Is Muhammad an excellent example, or is he not? If he is an excellent example, then the Dawa Muslim apologist types should stand on business and defend his acts for today, though they won't, because it's gross. Defense number two, she was mature. First of all, that's ridiculous. The hadith don't say this. They give specific ages, and they mention that she still played with dolls. Typically, a mature person doesn't play with dolls. But why does this maturity argument exist in the first place? Well, it's a modern apologetic layer added on top of the sources, but there's no basis for it. It is not a historically found defense, which then brings us to defense 3. The hadith are unreliable. The problem with this argument that some Muslims will try to throw out there is that these hadith appear in Bukhari and Muslim, the most authoritative Sunni collections. So rejecting them would undermine the entire Sunni hadith methodology. That's why most traditional scholars accept them and defend the morality of what Muhammad did based on the historical context of the time instead. This is where defenders get a little desperate and brings us to defense number 4. They would say she loved him later. But the problem is that this is a later relationship dynamic that doesn't actually resolve the moral issue of age and consent at consummation. Whether she loved him later or not doesn't change the fact that he raped a 9-year-old. And what's interesting about all this is that modern legal and ethical frameworks, including in many Muslim majority nations, recognize this clearly. And we can say this based on some of the law changes that have taken place. In some of these contemporary Muslim majority nations, civil law generally sets the legal age of marriage far higher than 9 years old. For example, Egypt sets it at 18. Morocco is at 18. Jordan is between 16 and 18. Indonesia at 19. And Saudi Arabia, following its 2019 legal reforms, sets it at 18. Okay, so these laws actually reflect a broad and modern consensus across both the secular and religious legal bodies in these countries that a child cannot give valid consent to marriage or sexual relations regardless of how they felt later or regardless of relational dynamics. So appealing to Aisha's adult perspective doesn't change the fact that by today's legal standards, by today's ethical standards, including those in many Islamic societies today, a 9-year-old is not considered capable of meaningful consent. Then there's defense 5 that they may give. Don't judge the 7th century by modern morals. Now, I believe this objection might matter, and that's a really small might, if Muhammad was simply a historical figure. But Islam claims he is a timeless model. So Evaluating his life morally is not merely westernizing the life of Muhammad. Okay? It's actually taking Islamic claims seriously. And when tested, these claims fall woefully short. With that said, let's compare standards here. Let's take a look at David Wood and how Christians deal with him and Muhammad. First, we have David Wood's past, right? His attempted murder of his father and his sexual abuse of minors were pre-conversion acts. He confesses them openly. He condemns them as evil. And Christians do not defend the actions. They don't. But instead, what we would do is we would highlight the transformational power of Christ in David Wood's life. If that's what he was, we can look at him now and see that he is different. But what does that say about Muhammad and Aisha and how Muslims respond to what took place there? Well, we know that the marriage and the consummation took place at a very young age. We know that these facts are treated by classical Sunni sources as historical realities. They're not treated as sin. The Prophet's life is presented as a moral example for all believers. And rather than taking issue with this, Islamic apologists actually give defenses that rely on historical relativism rather than real modern critique. This is in stark contrast because Christians condemn David Wood's sin and point to Jesus. David Wood condemns his past sin and he points to Jesus. But Islamic apologists defend Muhammad's actions, and they still call him the perfect pattern for believers. So what is the double standard? Dawa apologists use pre-conversion sins of a Christian apologist to discredit Christianity, all the while the actions ascribed to their prophet in their most trusted books are actually shielded from sound evaluation. That is not consistent reasoning, and it is hypocritical. With that said, I really want to talk about why the Christian framework holds together better than the Islamic framework. You see, the Bible is brutally honest about its heroes. There were some serious problems with its heroes, don't get me wrong. From David and what he did with Bathsheba to Paul rounding up Christians and systematically killing them, the Bible is very honest about them, that they were not perfect. Except for Jesus, of course. But what the Bible doesn't do, what Christianity doesn't do, is it doesn't rebrand sin as righteousness. Instead, the gospel is actually presented as a transformative power in people. That's what happened with Paul. The scales fell off his eyes. He repented of his sin, though he admitted that without Jesus, he's the worst of sinners. You see, in Christianity, repentance and regeneration are central aspects of the faith. That's what we see with David Wood. He repented of his past life as an atheist and is now living a regenerate life of leading others to Christ. And the good news is the Jesus David Wood defends is actually morally flawless, unlike Muhammad. There is no parallel to the Aisha narrative that Christians must defend. Regardless, you've got to hear me on this. Christianity holds sin and grace together, which is why we can say David Wood's past was evil, we can say victims were harmed, and we can say that justice matters still. But we can also say that Christ can redeem even the darkest sinners, whether that be David Wood or the Apostle Paul. But Christians do not claim David or any apologist is a timeless model. We point to Christ and Christ alone. That is a fundamentally different framework. So here's my appeal, especially if you are a Muslim listener or someone who follows Dawa content online. Consider using equal standards. If you reject David Wood's credibility because of his confessed pre-conversion sins, then be willing to evaluate Muhammad's actions as presented in Bukhari and Muslim. Ask whether it makes sense to condemn a repentant man for what he openly calls sin, while refusing to evaluate the example of someone your own texts present as consummating a marriage with a very young child who still played with dolls. I'm not asking you to trust David Wood. I'm asking you to look at Jesus, who transformed David Wood's life. Christianity rises and falls not on David Wood, the Apostle Paul, King David, or even me. It rises or falls on Jesus Christ himself. And when you compare the Jesus of the New Testament with the Muhammad of the classical Sunni sources, you're going to see a profound difference. One life requires layers of explanation and contextual defense, while the other can stand in the light without apology. That's why my hope is in Jesus alone. Thank you for listening to this special episode of the Bold Apologia podcast. May God bless you richly, and goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the Bold Apologia podcast. To find out more about Adam Parker's projects, writings, or guest podcast episodes, visit his website at www.boldapologia.com. There you can get more information regarding Adam's works, contact him to be a guest on your show, or leave him a comment for Q&A. Until next time, thank you and God bless.